So, thank you, Sjoerd. Thanks to all the organizers for the invitation. In what follows, I would like to say something about the way in which the English dynasty is portrayed in the work of Brabant chroniclers, such as Jan van Heelu, Jan van Boendale, and Lodewijk van Velthem. And my contribution ties in closely with a series of articles by Thea Summerfield on the portrayal of Edward I in Velthem's continuation of the Spiegel historiael, and can also be seen as a prequel to a recent article by Era Gordeau on Boendale and the King of England. And I'm glad that if I've seen, well, Thea and Era are both present in this online conference, and in the discussion they will undoubtedly be able to add nuance to my paper. So let me start with Jan van Heelu's work. In the study of Anglo-Dutch relations, his description of the Battle of Woeringen has traditionally received much attention because soon after the battle, probably in 1290, he dedicated this work to Margaret, daughter of King Edward I of England and future Duchess of Brabant. She was engaged to John, the son of Duke John I of Brabant, who plays a leading role in this story. According to Heelu, the English princess can use the rhymed story of almost 10,000 Middle Dutch verses about her father-in-law to learn Dutch. In my book, De Stem van de Meester, his master's voice, which deals with patronage at the court of Brabant, I've tried to show that this statement is difficult to take seriously. Heelu is primarily addressing the Brabant nobility, clergy, and especially the bourgeoisie, from whom, after his victory at Woeringen in 1288, Duke John of Brabant once again asked money, specifically for the upcoming marriage of his son. The text as a whole is a defense of the Duke's luxurious lifestyle, which costed a lot of money, but did lead to international prestige and important allies, and it explains why the victory at Woeringen did not yield any financial profit. The Brabanders killed all their opponents instead of taking them hostage. The dedication to the future Duchess, with a recommendation to learn Dutch from it, should most probably be read in the first place as a reassurance to the Brabanders that the most widely spoken language in the duchy, Dutch, would in the future play a significant role at court. Given this background, it's not surprising that Heelu makes little effort to make his text accessible to a non-Brabant audience. And for that matter too, he pays relatively little attention to England and the English court, with the exception of a remarkable passage that makes clear how the marriage agreement between England and Brabant came about. Heelu explains that Duke John, together with his brother Godfrey and some companions, attended many tournaments in the years around 1275 and thus gained much fame. In search of tournaments and parties, the company also went to England. In England, two of the Duke's tournament buddies, not coincidentally his later opponents, Walram of Valkenburg and Henry of Luxembourg, abandoned him to fight at the side of the rich Grave van Clare, or Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester. It was, according to Heelu, the English Queen who ensured that 6 important English noblemen joined the fight on the side of Brabant. And eventually Duke John won a resounding victory here as well. And this brought him so much prestige, still according to Heelu, that the English King Edward I offered his daughter as a husband for John, Duke John's son. The money that the Duke received on this occasion, and according to archival documents, this must have been quite a sum, was given away immediately. Again and again in his text, Heelu emphasizes that the Duke resembled the lion that appeared in his coat of arms. If a lion obtains prey, he immediately shares it with his supporters. And by the way, Heelu is reacting here to propaganda from the Duke's opponents in the Battle of Woeringen, now lost unfortunately, in which the Brabanders were compared to chickens and their Duke to a cockerel. Although Heelu tells some intriguing details about the English tournament, he does not elaborate on the English adventures of Duke John and his men. That would prolong the story too much, he notes. Heelu probably completed this text before July 1290, when the marriage of the Duke's son and the King's daughter was actually performed in England. Heelu writes nothing about the festivities, which must have been very impressive according to English sources. Duke John attended the feast with 18 knights and 60 damsels from Brabant, all of them beautifully dressed in Brabant manner. The grandeur of the feast is especially evident from the English account, which states that the bridegroom, Duke John's son, paid for no less than 426 minstrels performing at his wedding. Through the engagement and the marriage, the ties between England and Brabant were strongly reinforced, and John, the son of Duke John, who had already been staying at the English court since 1285, would stay there for several more years. He must have felt completely at home there. As long as his father had not died, he had no specific role to play in Brabant, and from the English court accounts, it can be concluded that the young man enjoyed himself very much in England. In his entourage, there were a lot of Brabanders, including a fiddler. The predilection of Duke John for tournaments eventually became fatal to him. He died in June 1294 from the injuries he had received at the tournament in Bar that was organized on the occasion of the marriage of the Count of Bar to another daughter of King Edward I of England. This fact is briefly mentioned in the Chronica de Origine Ducum Brabantiae from 1294 or shortly after, and also in Boendale's first version of the Brabantsche yeesten from 1316. Boendale's chronicle is for an important part an anthology from Jacob van Maland's Spiegel historiael. But for the more recent history, he makes use of the chronica. All references to England are, if I see correctly, taken from Maland or the chronica. He does not elaborate on the stay of the later Duke John II in England or on the acts of Edward I or his successor Edward II. As was the case with Heelu, this may have something to do with the setup of his work, which wanted to keep the focus on the history of the Brabant dynasty, and perhaps also with a lack of sources of information. It is only in his later work that Boendale showed more interest in the English dynasty, and even authored a work specifically about Edward III. But for that, I would like to refer to the work of Era Godot. She dug up additional sources that show that around 1340, Boendale not only had contacts with the English court in his hometown Antwerp, but also later in England itself, where on behalf of Duke John III of Brabant, he had to try to realize the promises the English king had made about the supply of wool. In the rest of my talk, I would like to take a closer look at the continuation of the Spiegel historiael by Lodewijk van Velthem. Velthem is a highly intriguing author, also in terms of Anglo-Dutch relations. Like Boendale, Velthem was strongly influenced by the work of the Flemish author Jacob van Maland. But while Boendale used the world history Spiegel historiael to create his own Brabant anthology, Velthem's ambition was a world chronicle that reached into his own time. In the so-called vijfde partie, or fifth part, Velthem tells the world's history from the middle of the 13th century up to and including the cataclysmic year 1316, and all this from his own unique perspective. Velthem used a wide variety of sources, both written and oral, both Latin and vernacular, but unfortunately, he is rarely explicit about them. Where source texts have been found, it appears that Velthem, who was a priest in daily life, made these sources completely his own, often including the original I narrator and without reference to titles or authors, especially where vernacular sources were concerned. Thus, he freely uses Heelu's work, which he interpolated in several places in his Spiegel historiael. Nowadays, we would call this plagiarism. Velthem takes over some passages from Heelu literally, while he has greatly shortened others. In the description of Duke John's tournament in England and the resulting engagement, which I have discussed here before, took up almost 80 verses in Heelu's text. Velthem reduced it to less than a quarter. And by the way, okay, then it works. By the way, the Brabant passages in Velthem's works were later interpolated in the Brabantsche yeesten, and in this context, they were illustrated as well. That's how Heelu's description of the English tournament finally got an illustration in this 15th century manuscript of the Brabantsche yeesten, and centuries later, this was even turned into a Belgian postage stamp, as you see it here. But back to Velthem. Thea Summerfield, in particular, has paid attention to the many passages that Velthem devoted to Edward I. In a publication from 2015, she offers this handy overview of all the passages by Velthem that deal with Edward. In total, this covers more than 3,000 verses. Velthem deals extensively with the conflict between Edward and his uncle Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, with the Arthurian festivities on the occasion of the king's marriage, and then also with the campaigns to subjugate Wales. Particularly interesting is the account of King Edward's adventures in Wales, which in Velthem's words takes on Arthurian allure. Velthem describes how Edward discovers in the Welsh woods more and more relics from the Arthurian times and experiences such wondrous things that he begins to realize that much more of the stories about King Arthur must be true than he could have imagined at first. In the context of the Spiegel historiael, these passages play a special role. Whereas Marland was, early on in this World Chronicle, very skeptical about the stories about King Arthur, Velthem's story about King Edward functions as a rehabilitation in a historical sense or a historiographical sense of these Arthurian stories. That Velthem knew several stories about King Arthur is, by the way, also evident from his description of the festivities at the wedding of Edward I, a description that contributed greatly to Edward's later reputation as an Arthurian enthusiast. The Arthurian and Edwardian passages in Velthem's chronicle also throw a special light on the so-called Lancelotcompilatie, a Flemish translation of the Lancelot en prose, which was adapted by a compiler from Brabant, most probably Velthem himself, who added several romances about King Arthur and forged the whole into a single story about the rise and fall of King Arthur's realm. Although this compilation is nowadays often read as the culmination of literary fiction in Dutch literature, Velthem's objectives were, in my opinion, in the first place, historiographic and ideological. From whom or what Velthem derived his information about King Edward is unfortunately impossible to determine. The chronicler must have been blessed with a rich imagination, but he rarely seems to have made things up from scratch. Where we can check it, he is mainly busy putting together information he collected here and there to make a more or less coherent story. Considering everything he knows about England and Edward I, he must have had several sources of information at his disposal, possibly including a Latin source about the festivities at Edward's wedding. Part of the information might also have been heard by Velthem orally, with all the distortions that could occur. As already became clear from the engagement and marriage of Duke John's son, many Brabanders must have visited the English court and, vice versa, many English noblemen traveled to the mainland. Certainly at the end of the 13th century, Edward was strongly involved in politics in the principalities in the Low Countries, including Flanders, Holland, and Brabant. Enough opportunities for the exchange of both written and oral information. A small part of what Velthem describes he could have observed himself. For instance, he explicitly states that he was in Ghent in the winter of 1297-1298 when King Edward was there waiting for a possible battle with the French army. Historical accuracy was not Velthem's main goal. In previous publication, I've tried to show that in 1317, when Velthem wrote his fifth part, he wanted to get his audience to side with the Flemish insurgents. And he did this by warning that God would avenge anyone who sided with the French king. And for this, he also makes use of political prophecies predicting the end of times, among which a remarkable prophecy which Velthem puts in the mouth of Merlin. I've not been able to identify a precise source for this, but Velthem seems to base himself on political prophecies that already circulated in Flanders during the conflict of 1297. In Merlin's prophecy, a lily, symbolizing the French, is attacked by three parties. Flanders, symbolized by a lion, the German emperor, symbolized by an eagle, and the English king, symbolized by a leopard. The heraldic symbolism was widespread at the time, as this image on the Anglo-French truce of 1297 underlines. Lodewijk van Velthem thus ends his chronicle in 1317 with a prophecy from which his readers and listeners, depending on their political point of view, could either hope or fear that the English king would soon intervene in the political situation in the Low Countries. For the time being, King Edward II had his hands full with the rebellious brothers Robert and Edmund Bruce, who, as kings of Scotland and Ireland, undermined his authority. And this also becomes clear from Velthem's chronicle, but this could change in the near future. And so, in doing so, Velthem laid the groundwork for a vision that emerged more often at the beginning of the 100 Years' War, also in the work of Jan van Boendale, the English dynasty as the avenging angel of God. Thank you for your attention.